All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling some pretty fascinating source material, really heady stuff.
Yeah, it's a deep dive for sure.
That's why we call it that, I guess, right? Anyway, we're going to be looking at early Chinese philosophy. Specifically, you guys sent us a bunch of stuff on how they viewed emotions. It's a really different perspective than what we're used to in the West.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some assumptions.
For sure. We're talking about thinkers, philosophers from roughly the 6th to the 1st century BCE. And the goal here, I think, is to unpack how they understood emotions. What did they think feelings were? How did they categorize them? And I think the most exciting part, at least for me, is seeing how their ideas contrast with kind of our default Western way of thinking about
Yeah, it's
emotions.
like holding up a mirror to our own assumptions,
Yeah.
making us really question what we take for granted.
Exactly. Because, when we think about emotions in the West, we tend to think about them as like these internal, personal, subjective experiences, right? Almost like they're separate from our rational minds. Think about Plato, right? He had that idea of the tripartite soul: reason, spirit, and appetite. And reason, the charioteer, was always trying to keep those wild horses of emotion in check.
Oh, absolutely. And the Stoics too, right?
Yeah.
They saw emotions as these excessive impulses that we need to control, suppress even, to live a virtuous life.
Yeah, and even later on, Descartes, super influential guy, he saw passions as these internal movements, these tendencies that are kind of triggered by external events. They can pull us away from reason. It's like emotions are this potentially disruptive force within us.
And, even though today in the West we're starting to reevaluate emotions, give them more attention, and study them in new ways, we're still kind of operating within that framework of subjectivity. Emotions are still seen as these personal motivators tied to our individual desires.
And that's what makes early Chinese philosophy so fascinating, because they had a totally different take on it. They didn't necessarily see emotions as purely subjective or irrational, right? Like these things to be feared or controlled.
Exactly. Instead, they saw them as playing these crucial roles, not only psychologically, but also morally. They believed emotions were central to becoming a virtuous person and even essential for social harmony. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and the emphasis was on how emotions connect us to the people around us, to our environment, even to the cosmos. One of our sources, Virag, put it beautifully. He said they saw emotions as the crucial interface between self and the world, mind and cosmos. Isn't that great?
It is. It really captures that sense of interconnectedness. It's not about separating the inner and outer worlds.
Right, and that brings us to a key concept we really need to unpack to understand their perspective, and that's king.
Ah, king. It's one of those terms that doesn't really have a direct equivalent in English. It's so much more than just emotions as we typically think of them.
Right, it's definitely more nuanced. So how would you break it down?
Well, think of it like this. King encompasses a whole range of meanings. It can refer to the essence of something, its fundamental nature, the actual reality of things, our inherent dispositions and desires, and yes, also feelings and emotions. But the key difference is that early Chinese philosophers didn't see king as opposed to our cognitive or intellectual functions.
So it wasn't like reason versus emotion, like that classic Western dichotomy.
Exactly. For them, king was part of this holistic understanding of how our minds engage with the world around us. And this engagement leads to all sorts of psychological states, including what we would call emotions.
Okay, so let's dig into this idea of king a bit more. I mean, you're right. In modern Chinese, when we hear king, it usually means emotions or feelings, right? But when we go back to those pre-Han texts, those really early sources, like from 500 to 200 BCE, we see that king had this much broader meaning. It could refer to things like factual truth, the genuine state of affairs, the essence of something, things that seem pretty unrelated to our modern understanding of emotions as internal experiences.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that makes studying early Chinese thought so fascinating. It really forces us to step outside our usual ways of thinking. And one scholar, A.C. Graham, he argues that in many of those pre-Han texts, trying to interpret king as our Western idea of passions just doesn't work. It doesn't fit.
It's just not a one-to-one translation, right?
Ree, he suggests that king in those texts often meant something more like the facts of the matter or what's truly real or genuine. But he also points out that there's a shift that starts to happen, especially in texts like the Zunzi and the Liji. King starts to be more explicitly linked to genuine inner feelings. So it's a concept that's evolving.
Okay, so there's this evolution of the term king. What else do our sources say about how it was understood?
Well, another scholar, Chad Hansen, he highlights this kind of dual nature of king, this seeming contradiction. On the one hand, you have this subjective inner experience, and on the other hand, you have this objective external state of affairs. and they both seem to be captured by King.
That is pretty paradoxical from our Western perspective, right?
It
All
is.
right.
But Hansen argues that this only seems like a contradiction if we're viewing it through our Western philosophical lens, which really emphasizes the separation between the inner and the outer, between subject and object, between emotion and reason. He says if we step outside those dualisms, we can see how these seemingly contradictory meanings of king can actually coexist quite peacefully.
So how do we reconcile those two meanings then?
Well, Hansen offers this really interesting interpretation of king as essentially inputs from reality, or what he calls reality-induced discrimination reactions. Think about our basic ability to distinguish light from dark, or to differentiate between sweet and sour tastes.
Hmm.
He's saying that in this sense, king is how we register and respond to the world. It's not just about some feeling bubbling up inside us. It's about this fundamental responsiveness to the world, to reality.
Reality-induced discrimination reactions. I like that. So it's more about this discernment, this interaction with the world around us rather than something purely internal.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then we have another perspective from Charles Bruya. He acknowledges both those aspects of king that we've talked about, the fact situations and the feelings emotions. But he goes a bit further and proposes that this wide range of meanings actually stems from an implicit early cosmology of spontaneous interrelation among things. In other words, the ancient Chinese worldview, where everything was seen as interconnected and constantly influencing each other, really shaped how they understood king creation.
So it's like this underlying worldview that everything's connected. It's not just some abstract idea. It's actually influencing how they're understanding something as basic as our feelings.
Absolutely. And Brew also points to that transition we touched on earlier, the shift in the understanding of king from this onto objective view, where it's more about the inherent nature of things, towards a more psycho-subjective understanding, where it's more directly tied to our inner feelings and emotions. He thinks this shift might have started pretty early on, maybe even in the Shujing, but it becomes more pronounced in thinkers like Mencius and Zunzi, who we'll talk about a bit later.
It's amazing how all these different interpretations kind of build on each other, each scholar adding another layer to our understanding of this complex concept. Then we have Christoph Harbsmeyer, who comes in with this really extensive list of king's meanings in pre-Buddhist China. I mean, he covers everything: the factual, the metaphysical, the political, the anthropological. He even includes positive moral qualities and basic personal motivations. It's like this huge tapestry of meanings.
Yeah, Harbsmeyer's list really drives home the point that for the early Chinese, king wasn't confined to this little box of inner feelings. It was this fundamental aspect of how they understood the world, their place in it, their relationships to each other, to the cosmos. It touched on pretty much every aspect of existence.
Wow. Okay, so now we have Zheng Sik, who tries to bring all these threads together. He proposes three interconnected dimensions of king. First, you have the ontological dimension, which deals with the dynamic nature of existence itself, like the very essence of being. Then there's the epistemological dimension, which relates to how we perceive and experience reality. And finally, you have the psychological and moral dimension, which encompasses our emotional expressions and feelings. And Siacock argues that all three of these dimensions are interconnected through this constant interaction between the self and the world.
It's a beautiful way to try and capture the complexity of king. What might seem like contradictions or inconsistencies in its various meanings, when you look at them through this holistic lens, actually reveal a very integrated and sophisticated understanding of the mind and its connection to the world. It wasn't about carving up experience into these neat little categories of emotions versus reason versus objective reality for that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about king in general, this broad concept. But how about specific emotions? How did these early Chinese philosophers actually categorize the different feelings we experience?
Well, there is this common set of four that pops up quite often. Qinueye, which translates to joy, anger, sadness, and pleasure. This quartet seems to represent this core emotional landscape for them.
Okay, so four basic emotions, but did they have more specific categories? Did they break it down further?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, as we dig into the different texts, we find a whole variety of lists that detail what they consider king as emotions. The Li Ji, for example, gives us 7: joy, anger, sadness, fear, love, disliking, and liking.
7. Oh,
Then you have the Zunzi, which actually offers a couple of different lists. One of them, interestingly enough, includes persuasion and reason, alongside the more typical emotional categories. And we see lists in other texts, too, like the Zhuangzi, the Xingzi Mingqiu, the Naiye, and later in the Bai Hu Tong. So there's a real diversity in how they categorized emotions.
it's interesting to see how some of these categories map onto Western ideas about emotions, isn't it? Like when you look at Descartes' 6 primitive passions: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, sadness. There's a fair bit of overlap, maybe minus the wonder, and even Ekman's famous basic emotions, joy, anger, sadness, fear, disgust, surprise, the ones that are thought to be universal across cultures. Those line up pretty well with some of the categories we see in these early Chinese lists.
Yeah, the overlaps are pretty striking, and it suggests there's some shared human experience of emotion, some common ground. But then you have those unusual categories that really make you think, like persuasion and reason. In the Zunzi, what does that even mean in the context of emotions? And then there's profit or material interest in the Nye. These categories really blur the lines between what we in the West would typically categorize as cognitive processes and emotional responses.
It challenges those neat little boxes we like to put things in, right?
For sure. And it raises questions about what they even considered the scope of emotions to be. Were they seeing this closer connection between thought and feeling than we typically do?
Right. And then there's this ambiguity within the lists themselves. Like, are these meant to be completely separate, distinct emotions? Or are they more like broader categories or even spectra? Is easy, new, joy, and anger sometimes used to represent like the full range of emotions?
That's a great point. It's not always clear. And we can't assume they had this super rigid system of classification like we try to do in modern psychology. Their understanding seems to have been much more fluid and contextual.
It makes sense given what we were talking about earlier, how Paisking itself had such a broad range of meanings.
Exactly. And another thing to keep in mind, as Harbsmeyer points out, is that many of the specific terms for emotions that we see in these later texts, words like joy, anger, sadness, fear, love, disliking, desire, and even related psychological terms like heart, think of, ambition, those were largely absent in the much earlier oracle bone inscriptions. So it seems like there was this gradual evolution in how they even conceptualized and talked about emotions.
So the very language they used to describe these experiences was changing over time.
It was. And it's interesting to note that some of the earliest terms that did exist, they related more to bodily or behavioral states, which again hints at this broader, less internal view of the mind that we've been talking about.
Okay, so now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how some of these key philosophical texts actually engage with the idea of emotions. We've laid out some of the general concepts, but how did specific thinkers apply these ideas? Let's start with the Analects of Confucius. What stands out to me is his emphasis on genuine affective states as being absolutely essential for cultivating virtue. Like, he famously said that Ren, benevolence, is fundamentally about loving others.
Yes, and he also placed immense importance on sincere sorrow in mourning rituals. For Confucius, true virtue wasn't just about performing the right actions outwardly. It had to be rooted in genuine feeling.
Right. It's about the inner state, the true intention behind the action. And we see him discussing all sorts of emotions, joy, sorrow, liking, worry, and he even expresses his own feelings openly, like his joy in learning and his deep grief for his disciple Yan Yan. So it's not like he's saying we should be emotionless robots.
No, not at all. Emotions are very much at the heart of his ethical framework. But it's fascinating that while emotions are so central to his thinking, the term king itself, when it appears in the Analects, often carries meanings closer to genuineness, truthfulness, or the specific situation at hand, rather than a direct reference to inner feelings like we see in later texts.
Interesting. So the word itself is still evolving, even within these foundational texts. Okay, so next we have Mozi and his philosophy of Jian-I, impartial caring. It's a really interesting idea. He basically proposed this as the solution to all the problems in the world, which he saw as stemming from partiality, from people favoring their own group over others.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical idea. He seems to have viewed spontaneously arising emotions as potentially problematic because they can be biased and inconsistent. Right?
Yeah.
You naturally feel more for your family than for strangers. So he presented Jenna as this cultivated, unbiased concern for the well-being of all people equally.
Right, like a universal love. And one of our sources even calls it an unemotional will to benefit, which is a bit of a head scratcher, right? Because how can you have love without emotion? So there's been a lot of debate about whether Jian-I actually involved genuine affection or more of a detached sense of responsibility.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, Mozi's definitely advocating for a kind of love that extends beyond our natural inclinations towards those closest to us. He has this famous argument where he says we should regard others' states as equivalent to our own, which really underscores this call for impartiality. But the philosophical challenge, of course, is how do you motivate that kind of impartial caring? Can you really do it through purely rational argument, or does it require some kind of emotional component?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm also noticing that Again, when we look at the Mozi, the term king itself usually refers to the objective reality of the world, like human nature, or the social and political environment, or truthfulness. It's not so much about our internal feelings. So it seems like this way of understanding king was pretty common in these early texts.
Absolutely, it's a consistent theme. Now, when we get to Mencius, we see a shift back towards the importance of innate emotional foundations for morality. He really emphasized this idea of the heart mind, and he's famous for his concept of the four moral sprouts, or Sijuan: pity and compassion, shame and dislike, modesty and compliance, and a sense of right and wrong. He saw these as inherent emotional tendencies that are rooted in our very human nature. They're like the seeds of morality that we all have within us.
Yeah, and he famously uses that example of the child about to fall into the well to illustrate this point. Anyone seeing that would feel this immediate urge to save the child, regardless of whether it's their own or strangers. That's Buren, that inability to bear seeing others suffer. He's saying it's instinctive, this capacity for compassion.
Exactly. And this is where King connects for Mencius. He sees King as the genuine nature or essence of humanity that manifests in these spontaneous emotional reactions, like Buren. These Siduan aren't just fleeting feelings for Mencius. They're deeply embedded in our very being and represent the potential for moral goodness. He even compares the cultivation of these sprouts to agriculture. You need to nurture them, tend to them, for them to grow into full-fledged virtues.
It's a beautiful analogy, and Mencius really criticizes those who he felt lacked this essential element of a caring heart, like some of the Mohists. For him, genuine emotions like love and concern were absolutely fundamental to becoming a truly moral person.
And again, while king in the Mencius primarily still means something closer to our nature or the reality of a situation, it's clearly linked to the foundation of these moral emotions, particularly in the context of the Sijuan. There's a passage where he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "From the feelings, or king, proper to it," meaning our nature, "it is constituted for the practice of what is good." So he's drawing this connection between our inherent nature, our emotional dispositions, and our capacity for moral action.
Okay, so we've got Confucius emphasizing genuine feeling for virtue, Mosi advocating for this universal impartial care, and Mencius focusing on these innate moral sprouts rooted in our emotional nature. Now let's move on to Zunzi, who takes a bit of a different approach. He's known for having a more naturalistic and psychological perspective on emotions. He focuses more on the mind's inherent functions and reactions rather than these innate moral orientations.
Right. He saw cunning more as our natural dispositions, like the desires for food and material possessions. And he actually viewed these dispositions as potentially disruptive if left unchecked. They could lead to conflict and social chaos if we don't learn to manage them.
So for Zunzi, it's less about these emotions being inherently good or bad, and more about understanding how they work, how they influence our behavior.
Exactly. And he's very explicit about linking king with psychological states. There's a quote where he says, "The feelings of liking and disliking, happiness and anger, and sadness and joy in one's nature are called the dispositions," or king. So he's very clearly connecting king to what we typically understand as emotions.
It seems like he's getting closer to our modern understanding of emotions as internal experiences.
He is. But for him, these emotions are rooted in our nature, which he saw as fundamentally driven by self-interest and desires, which he called you. He had this famous formula where he said, heaven gives rise to nature, nature gives rise to dispositions, king, and dispositions give rise to desire. So king is this crucial link between our essential nature and our psychological desires.
So for Zunzi, understanding and managing our king is essential for creating a harmonious society. It's about shaping our natural dispositions through things like ritual and education.
Exactly. Now, it's interesting to compare Xunzi's view of king with what we saw in the Mozi, where king mostly referred to objective reality, like human nature or the social environment. Zunzi is definitely shifting the focus more towards the internal psychological experience of emotions.
It's another example of how this concept was evolving over time. But even though he has this more naturalistic view, the genuineness of emotion is still important for Zunzi. It's not just about suppressing our feelings, it's about refining them, shaping them in a way that's beneficial for both the individual and society.
Right. It's about cultivating our emotional responses through things like ritual and music. So even though he has a different take on the nature of king, he still sees a role for emotional authenticity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Confucius, Mozi, Mencius, and Zunzi. Now let's move on to two of the most famous Taoist texts, the Laozi, also known as the Tao Te Ching, and the Zhuangzi.
Sounds good.
It's interesting to note that the term king itself doesn't actually appear in the Laozi, But that
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's not concerned with emotions. There are discussions of specific emotions like anger, resentment, courage, loving kindness, which is C, and of course desire, which is U.
Right, and Laozi seemed to view emotions as having this very powerful, lasting impact on us. They could either support our well-being or threaten it, depending on how we manage them. He talks about the three treasures, compassion, frugality, and humility, and how they relate to things like courage and effective leadership.
And there's that famous line, repay resentment with virtue, which suggests that we can choose how we respond to difficult emotions. We're not just at their mercy.
Exactly. And desire, is a recurring theme in the Laozi. He's generally pretty cautious about it. He emphasizes its exclusive nature and its potential to cloud our understanding of the Tao. There's a passage where he talks about needing both desire and desirelessness to truly observe the Tao's manifestations and its underlying mysteries. So it's not about simply rejecting all desire, it's more nuanced than that.
It's like finding that balance, that middle way.
Right. It's about understanding how desire works, how it can both help us and hinder us on our path.
Okay, so finally, we come to the Zhuangzi. And here we see a really different perspective. Emotions are viewed more as natural phenomena, like the weather. They just arise spontaneously. There's even a passage that lists emotions alongside natural events, like wind and rain. It's a very different approach than what we saw in the Confucian texts, where there's this emphasis on seeking ontological or moral foundations for emotions.
Yeah, it's much more about acceptance, about going with the flow. And there's that famous dialogue between Huizi and Zhuangzi, where Huizi asks if it's really possible to be without feelings, without king. And Zhuangzi clarifies that he's not talking about becoming some emotionless robot. He's talking about not allowing our likes and dislikes, our preferences, to rule us, to cause us inner turmoil. He's saying we should accept the feelings that naturally arise as part of our being. He calls them insing mingjiking, the feelings proper to our inborn nature.
So it's not about suppressing emotions, it's about not getting caught up in them, not letting them dictate our actions.
Exactly. He cautions against indulging our desires and letting our preferences create all this internal conflict. It's a very different approach from someone like Sunzi, who saw emotions as something that needs to be refined and cultivated for the sake of social order. Zhuangzi values their natural spontaneity as being essential for authentic experience. He sees beauty in that natural flow of feeling.
So to wrap things up, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how early Chinese philosophers had this incredibly rich and nuanced understanding of emotions. It was so different from the way we typically think about emotions in the West.
Absolutely. And what's really striking is that there wasn't one single unified Chinese view on emotions. There's this ongoing conversation, this debate among different philosophical schools, each with their own unique perspective. But what they all shared was this emphasis on the interconnectedness of things, this idea that our emotions aren't just these isolated internal experiences, but are deeply entwined with our relationships, our environment, even the cosmos.
Right, and it makes you think about your own experiences of emotion in a new light. What would it mean to view our feelings not just as these personal, subjective states, but as something that connects us to the world around us, to something bigger than ourselves?
It's a profound question. And it makes you wonder, if we were to adopt a more holistic perspective on emotions, like the early Chinese philosophers, how might that change the way we approach self-awareness, ethical decision-making, even our understanding of what it means to be human?
Could embracing the spontaneous and interconnected nature of our feelings, as advocated by Zhuangzi, lead to a different kind of wisdom than the Confucian emphasis on cultivating and refining our emotions? It's something to think about.
Definitely. Food for thought.
We always like to leave you with some food for thought. And we highly encourage you to explore these ideas further, to delve into the source material yourself. These ancient texts offer a wealth of wisdom that can still speak to us today. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.